Payments is where you'll enter cash purchases, whether you are printing a check or recording a handwritten check or adding to an ACH payment. Payments is also where you'll enter line of credit purchases if you're using a line of credit account, or paying vendor open invoices. Let's go to our payment screen. Under Processes, Purchases, and Payments. A large amount of your entries in the transaction will be selecting items from your various setup lists, beginning with your company. Each one of your fields that have a lookup will have a magnifying glass that you can click on to display all of the items in that particular list. In this sample data, we have only one company. If you have more than one item in the list, you could use your up-down arrows or just click on the one you want or use the search for. And you'll be able to search for any of the columns that you have displayed. In this one, we have abbreviation and name displayed. We're going to select the company and hit our tab key. Tab key moves from field to field. But before we talk about the bank account, in the upper right is a current batch, which defaults to no batch, meaning that when you save this transaction, it will post and it will do whatever the print options are assigned on this particular entry. If you don't want the transactions to post at this time because you want to put in information on it additionally at a later time, or you want several transactions to just all post and print at one time, or someone has to approve it, then you can use a batch. You can either create a batch from processes and batch transactions, or you can click in current batch, right click and do new and create a new batch. If you're using a batch, then you'll use that same batch for all the transactions that you want to post in that particular batch. And you can have as many batches as needed. I'm going to tab to my bank account field, and we have a bank account. Another way to select an item in a list is just typing in a couple of characters, and we have a bank account called Cash in Bank, and that brought up my checking account. Whenever you are in a lookup list, you can right click and there are several menu items that you can use. I could edit this bank account if I needed to make a change in the name or some other detail. I could click edit. That brings up the detail of that particular item, and I can make changes and resave it. I could make a new account from here, or I could set this as a default. And setting as default means that the next time I bring up the payment screen, it will automatically fill in that piece of information. So if I were to set the Cash in Bank as set as default and close the transaction, I'll bring it back up from my quick list payments over here at the left. Now it has my bank account filled in because I have it set as default. If you have multiple companies, this is also handy for multiple companies. You can have one particular company set as a default. The other thing you can do is set the default bank account for each company that you're using. And it's just a little shortcut to not have to select that field. After you select the bank account, the current balance of that bank and for that company will be displayed at the right. And then you can tab to the next field, which is paid to the order of, representing the vendor that you are paying for this transaction. There are several ways to select the vendor. Again, you could click the lookup. And if you click the lookup, we have a new button at the bottom. If this is a new vendor that you have not added yet, you could click new. That would bring up the name detail to fill in the information. Or there is also a new one-time use. Used if you are sure that you're not going to use this particular vendor very much and you just want to use it this one time. The difference is, first of all, it will bring up a modified detail screen and you just have to fill in the name and save it. And when you save it, it will automatically be marked as inactive instead of an active name on the list for future use. On your lookup of your names, you also have a checkbox of Show Only Active. If you want to get back to a name that has been inactivated, you can uncheck this box. That would show all names. And that toggles between being checked or unchecked. The other way to get to inactive, if you right-click in the name field, Show All Items is one of the right-click menu items, it toggles between show all items and show only active items. Another option on the right-click menu is to review transactions. So for this particular vendor I selected, if I click Review Transactions, it would bring up all the transactions that were to that particular vendor. Let's pick a different vendor, and I will, I know I have some entries in here for Summit Utility Company. If I right-click and click Review Transactions, here are all the transactions that have been entered for that particular vendor. And I could double-click and edit that transaction, make any changes if I wanted to, resave it, or just browse through the transactions to see what had been used in prior entries. Another option is how you want the grid filled in the bottom of the screen, identifying what this payment is for. The options are to leave the transaction empty, meaning all my fields are left empty, or to recall last transaction. That would mean that when you select that vendor, it would automatically retrieve the last transaction posted to this particular vendor. Or if this vendor has a reoccurring transaction assigned to it, it would load the default reoccurring transaction. And I'll show you one of those. I have a Summit Water, and you'll see this little reoccurring button is lit up in yellow. That indicates that there is a reoccurring transaction assigned to this particular vendor. And that is saying that every time I use this vendor, I want it to go to this account of water and sewer expense account. And if I put the amount in up here of whatever that is, it would automatically assign that to my grid in the transaction detail, and I'm ready to save it. So it's a shortcut of entering that transaction. I am going to clear this. I just selected a different vendor. It came up and asked, do you want to clear the information for this current transaction? There might be cases where you have used some entries in the grid of what account you wanted to go to. And if you wanted to reuse that for the vendor that you switched to, you could do that by saying no, and it wouldn't clear it. I'm going to say yes and have it clear that transaction. I picked my supplies plus by typing in SUPP and tab, and that was, it found that one name in my list that began with those letters. There is a right-click option to do your lookups either by begin with or contains. And right now it's doing begin with, and it found a name that began with that. But if I switch to contains and then do my SUPP again, it found several more names because that particular string of characters is in all of these names that it brought up on the list, including the one that began with supplies, but it has several others that have supplies within that name. So it's two different ways of doing your lookup and a preference. This will toggle between begins with and contains. And then there's your options with your lookup option. And there is a video on lookup options to help you in knowing how to use the different features here with the abbreviations and names, and making it easiest for you to move through selecting the items in the list. So we're going to go back to our Summit Utility, and I am ready to tab to my next field, which is my address. It will bring up the address that is in the detail screen of your name. If you want to switch that address, because your names can store more than one address, then I can switch to a different address if the case is that I want this one going to a different address with the check printed to this address instead of the business address. And then I go over to my sequence. The sequence is identifying how the check number is getting populated. So I have a couple of different sequences here. I have an EFT. If I were to choose an EFT, because this was an EFT, it would fill in that particular string of characters. Or if I do my payments, which it's defaulting to, then it would bring up my next check number because my previous one was 3570. So it's just a way of managing your check number, and these sequences are stored if your sequence is set to be stored by company and bank account, the different company bank account combinations will each have their own storage of the next number. And then I'm going to go to the date, which will put in your system date or the last day of the last period that's opened up in CenterPoint. And then to my amount. The amount can be empty if you have several things that you're paying for and your grid is going to be identifying several different things. You can put in the different pieces of information and then click Adjust Amount at the end and it will figure out the total for you. Or you can start with a total if you know what that's going to be. And if we start with a total, that's going to default into our grid as the amount on the first line. And then we tab to the memo field, and the memo field is going to print on our checks. And in our checks at the bottom, if that's usually for the account number, if you have identified a memo on your vendor, like it was done here, the account number was put in the detail for that particular name, it'll fill that in for you on line 2. You can put whatever you want additionally on memo line 1, and these will print on your check. And we'll tab through. On the Apply to Open Invoices, if this particular vendor had open invoices, they would be displayed on the screen and the button would be lit up in yellow. And you can select which of the open invoices you want to pay on this particular payment, and then this would be a payable payment instead of a cash expense. In this case, we're going to just do a purchase. And if the case were that you were purchasing a sales item inventory item, then you would pick the item first. For example, in this particular company, they purchased some road bikes to resell. So we could select that item and it would fill in the account based on the item. And then you would fill out the number that you were buying and the amount that you were paying. But for our Summit Utility Company, we're going to go right to our account because we just do this to our electric company. So it's for electricity and gas, and then we're going to go to the amount. So if this were the only thing that you were entering for this transaction, you could put in a notation if you want to, but you would be ready to save it. And so we'll just go ahead and save this transaction. Down at the bottom are your print options for how you want this for printing. We'll click the printer and it's set to do not print. It has the red X. If we wanted to print a check, then we click the print check and make sure that the printer that we want to put our checks in is identified correctly. It will pick this up from your preferences on printing checks also. And click OK. That puts a check mark, green check mark on the printer indicating that this is going to print. If this were an ACH payment, then you would click Add to ACH file, and the icon would have an ACH with a green check mark. The little button that is a scan icon, if you want to attach a document and you need to scan it first, you can click that scan icon, and that would allow you to scan that document and then attach it to this transaction. Or the paperclip allows you to browse out to a file that's already existing on your computer and attach that to this transaction. And then this yellow paper, or the paperclip would be now displayed in yellow if there is an attachment on that entry. The buttons down at the bottom, you can click the Save button, and the Save would save this transaction and at the same time print the check in this case because we're not in a batch. So it would save and post and print. Clear is going to clear the transaction like that. We're going to go ahead and fill in a company again. And this time we're going to select our rental company that we rent the office from. That's Lakeside Rentals. And you can click the recall. Well, even though I have not on this particular transaction set that action to recall last transaction, I can click the recall button down at the bottom, and that will bring the last transaction that I've done with this particular vendor. and fill in the amount and all of the details. So all I would need to do is change whatever detail I wanted on this particular transaction, and I'm ready to save it. The reoccurring is if I want this transaction as it is to be a reoccurring, so that the next time I choose Lakeside Rentals, it would automatically come up to be a reoccurring transaction. And there is a video on using reoccurring transactions also. And the recall, there is a video for that one too. And then over on the right is our options. I can review transactions. If I click that, that'll bring up the last 10 transactions that I've done for this particular company and bank account. And I could edit from here on those transactions and change anything I needed. I can also do custom fields if I have in my preference set up some custom fields and I want those custom fields for printing on the check through my forms designer. I can use that. Recall by company is toggling between recall by company and recall by company bank. That means that when I use the recall, I can have the recall be looking at just the company, regardless of which bank, or I can have the recall work for anything with just that company and bank account combination. And then I can set tab stops. So if there are some different tab stops that I don't want to stop at, or I do want to stop at, this is where I can do a change of what I want to stop at and what I don't. So if I wanted to stop at the memo lines rather than clicking my mouse in there, I could do that, check those boxes. And then what would happen if I put my amount here and I tab, now it's going to stop at the memo line 1 and the memo line 2 before it goes to account. And then my refresh is if I want to refresh some things on the screen that I've changed. So the other thing that you can do in your transaction entry is customize what you see in this grid. If I right click on the blue row and choose add remove columns, I can go through and add any columns that I want to add that I might typically want. I use it more routinely, so I want it on the front screen rather than having to click the detail button. So I'm going to go through and maybe I want to see profit center. And there is also a line sequence that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to turn those fields on, and the green up and down arrows lets me also order those how I want. I'm going to click the striped up arrow to gather those to the top. And then let's say I want profit center further up and bring the detail button down here. I'm going to click OK, and that refreshes my screen. Let's say that we are purchasing some other things, maybe some, they did a repair for us and we're going to pay them for that for some reason. And when we print this, we wanted that actually to be the first one on the list because you're maybe you're putting in an entry with several different things and you want to match up to that printed document that you're trying to refer to. You can do that with your line sequence. So over at the far right, it is ordering these items as we put them on the list with the numbers of 10, 20, 30, 40. But if I want to put this item before the other one, I could change this number to an 8 and then click refresh, and that would reorder it. So it's a way to manage the order that you want printed on your check so that it would match whatever you're referring to. And as you're putting in the entries, of course, after you select the item, then you can fill in any of the details as needed. If I wanted a profit center here, I can put the profit center. And if I want to see all the details that are available, you can click the detail button and then see the details that are available for this particular template, which is DT increase expense. And those are some different things you can do on your entry screen. Down at the bottom, if my amounts do not total up to what I have at the top of the screen, I can click adjust amount like that, and that would change my amount up at the top. Let's change this one more time. And if I don't total that and I click save, it'll come up and give me a warning that the total of my subdivisions don't match the total of the top. Do I want to continue? And if I do, it'll use the total of the subdivisions. If I say yes, it'll save it and do that. If I do no, then I can come back and make the changes that I need, and then go ahead and save my transaction. And those are some things in working with your payment screen.